Hello, my name is Tamsin Peach and welcome to another episode of History Lab Live, where we bring you recordings of conversations about Australian history happening in bookshops, universities and public venues across the country. In this episode, historians and political analysts look back at the May 2025 Australian federal election to ask what it can tell us about where Australian politics has been and where it might be headed. Are we witnessing a genuine political realignment, or is this a familiar pattern repeating under new conditions? You'll hear journalist and commentator George Megalogenis, who is renowned for his ability to wring fresh insights from historical data. And then Frank Bongiorno will perform his ideal version of a Labor Prime Minister. Keep dreaming, Frank. Before Elizabeth Humphreys gives her take on how institutional decay is feeding an anti-politics. And finally, Ben Spies-Butcher explains how asset ownership is the single biggest divide in the electorate. Can a landslide signal fragility as much as stability? Does a big victory necessarily translate into lasting authority? This conversation took place at UTS in September 2025 and was hosted by Emily Foley.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Dr Emily Foley. I'm a postgraduate researcher over at Flinders University on Kaurna Country in Adelaide and also at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy at the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. And I'd also like to acknowledge we're on Gadigal land. It's always important to acknowledge that First Nations people were the original knowledge bearers and sharers of this country and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So the idea for this discussion came out of the May 2025 election. And so this was a contest that was at once decisive, but also quite uncertain. There was a government that was returned with a huge majority, but it was also built on a historically low primary vote. And so that sort of paradox raises some pretty big questions. And the question that we were thinking about grappling with is, does it signify stability or fragility? And are we seeing a rupture in the political order or a realignment that reflects deeper demographic and social shifts? So tonight, our amazing panellists are going to explore these questions. They're going to be looking at topics like the erosion of the major party duopoly, the reshaping role of gender and class, the anger and aspirations of younger voters, and how Australia's trajectory compares to other countries. And I guess at the heart of all of this is the broader question of what does this all mean for Australian democracy? So now I'm going to introduce our panellists. So to start, George Megalogenis is an author and a journalist with over 30 years in the media, including a decade in the Federal Press Gallery. His latest quarterly essay, Minority Report, explores the strategies and secret understandings of a political culture under pressure. Then we have Frank Bongiorno, a professor at the Australian National University and one of the country's foremost historians and one of the country's favourite historians, I would say, whose works include the 80s, the decade that transformed Australia, and Dreamers and Schemers, a political history of Australia. And then finally, Elizabeth Humphreys, the head of discipline of social and political sciences at UTS. And her research examines the impact of economic crisis and climate change on workers. Her book, which I used a lot in my PhD, is How Labor Built Neoliberalism, and it was described by the Sydney Review of Books as a tremendously important contribution to understanding Australia's recent past. Okay, I'll stop talking now. Without further ado, I'll invite George to come and have a chat with us. Thank you.
Thanks all for coming out on a Tuesday night, and thank you, Elizabeth, especially for the invite. We've been talking about this for a few months, and going into an election that 2 weeks out began to rumble like a swing to the government, which in itself is unusual for a second-term federal government. I think on the night, no one could have predicted 94 seats for Labor. I know that the people on the Labor side thought a little over 80 would have been optimistic, a net gain of about 3 or 4 seats. And I have done some checking afterwards, and a couple of people in the know, I've asked them, well, 94, did you ever think you'd get to 94? And one person explained it quite simply. Well, put it this way, we didn't target 94. So there were about 10 or 12 there that turned up for them on the night, which they didn't expect. And that is from the horses' plural mouths. And because it was a second-term landslide. Obviously, Labor had a very, very low entry into office with a tiny majority of 2 seats on the floor of the parliament. They only had 77 out of the 151. And I know Frank and I have been talking about this in the past. We thought that there might be a little echo in what occurred over a number of state elections now, going way back to Neville Rand's sort of 1-seat majority in 76 and then his double landslide subsequent elections. Same thing happened to Peter Beattie in Queensland, same thing happened with Steve Bracks in Victoria, and the same happened again with Daniel Andrews in Victoria. You get Labor governments coming in at a state level on a very, very narrow mandate, and then they blow out second and even third term landslides. And the story on the other side, and maybe this is one thing I shouldn't be flagging too many things for discussions. The thing to think about is what happens to an opposition when they go to landslide defeat in the second term. The state examples tell you that the coalition, when they're in opposition, they tend to be in opposition for a while and they get very, very ragged very quickly in opposition. Menzies, in one of his memoirs, did say that there's nothing more divisive for a party than a defeat, especially a number of defeats in a row. Parties tend to eat each other alive at that point in opposition. And just a very, very casual observation, which I wouldn't necessarily tease out for the federal sphere just yet, but we have observed, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years that those coalition parties, when they've been smashed at a state level and have been out for a while, when they do come back into power, they don't last long. Even the Greiner government, after Neville Rand's double landslide, went in a minority after a single term. The coalition government, National Party-led government in Queensland, was out after a single term in 98. The coalition government in Victoria, the Baillieu-Napthine government, was out after a single term as well. So when you ask yourself almost the primary question of whether we're looking at a realignment election or, as Wayne Swan just described the other day, a victory for Labor that was very, very broad but very, very thin, I'd sort of wonder what those precedents tell us. A, about how long Labor are in office for at a federal level, and B, what it means for the next coalition government if they've been away from office for a while. They're sort of like the off the top of the head observations, but I just want to go to some mechanics, and the mechanics are just sort of framing statements, really. So we don't have to look at any slides, but you can get the sense of the numbers and the story that the numbers are telling. We've had a net swing against the major parties at each federal election since 2007. So the duopoly, as you define it, Labor and coalition, have gone backwards together, even if one is up and the other's down. The two of them have gone backwards together at every federal election since 2007. So that's 10, 13, 16, 19, 22 and 25. And there are a couple of headlines within that major observation. Last time Labor was above 40% primary was 2007, and that's the Kevin 07 election victory. Last time the coalition, so Liberal and National parties, were above 40% primary vote was 2019. That's the miracle election for Scott Morrison. The last time the duopoly was above 80% together was 2010. That's a hung parliament. And any guess when the last time they were above 90 together? It's the Joe for Canberra campaign, 1987. So you're looking at the trend decline in the two-party system and a ratchet up, especially since 2010, of the third-party vote, which is the independent and minor party vote. We observe, obviously, at the last federal election that the independent and minor party vote exceeds the primary vote of the coalition for the first time for them since the Second World War. I just want to break those primary numbers down. I haven't given you the national figures. I want to break them down between metropolitan and non-metropolitan seats. And the story within the story is not the one I expected when I looked at it. I assumed that the third-party vote was bigger in the cities than it was in the bush, because I thought the coalition's vote was a little more stable in the bush. But it turns out the reverse is true. So the last federal election, so 2025, in May, ALP primary is just under 39%. That's in the cities. Coalition primary is only 29. It's 29.1, Labor's is 38.8. So there's a good 10-point gap there. And the none of the above vote is 32.1. That's a little lower than I imagine it would be in the cities. So remember, in the cities, you're looking at Greens, Teals and the like. And just below the line, the Green vote is roughly double the Hanson and Palmer vote in the capital cities. Now, non-metropolitan electorates, this is where it gets fascinating for me. Labor's primaries is just under 29% to 28.6. Very low. Coalition's 35.7, which was their national vote 2 elections ago in 2022. That is very low for the coalition, which means that the minor party vote is equal to the coalition vote outside the capital cities, 35.7. And there's a big independent, Hanson, Palmer, you add Katter into that pile, and Greens. So whereas Hanson, Katter, Palmer get to about 11.5%, the Greens are around 11 themselves. So the Greens are doing all right in the outside of the major metropolitan areas. Now that is a structural problem. If I were looking at that with my sort of long-term view, I think the structural problem is on the coalition side, it's not on the Labor side. Now, I don't think that Labor's majority is as brittle as it appears if their primary vote's just under 40, or it's under 39 in the cities. And you add about 11 for the Greens, so you get to 50 between the two of them in the cities. So the seat count, I'm going to run you through the seat count, and I just want to get your heads around why we've seen a realignment over 2 elections. So a landslide defeat for the coalition in 2022 and a landslide backed up by a landslide victory for Labor in 2025. Now, I go back to 2019 and I've split, again, we'll do this without charts because you just get the sense with the big round numbers. If you split the electorate between the capital cities, the seats won in the capital cities and the seats won in the regions. ALP in 2019, and remember this is an election they expected to win and they went backwards, they had 46 in the capitals and 22 outside of the capital cities, so rest of state. And that includes big provincial towns, second cities like a Geelong or a Newcastle. So 46, 22 gets them to 68, which is clearly not enough. The coalition had 31 in the capitals, so 15 less than Labor in the capitals, but they had 46 in the regions. So remember why Scott Morrison was giving a shout out to Queensland? Essentially, that election is decided outside Brisbane because it's a score draw everywhere else, including all the other regions. But by the time you get to the sort of peri-urban part of North Brisbane and then you get into the regions of Queensland, that's where the coalition got its very narrow majority. Now, what happened next in 2022 was a path to power for Labor, which was theoretically foreseeable, but very, very difficult to see how you'd shoot the lights out for it to happen in the way it did for the government. So they won essentially in the capital cities because their regional representation didn't increase by much. They only went up from 22 to 24, but their seat count in the capitals went from 46 to 53. So they did all right. The coalition went from 31 down to 14 in the capitals. And you know what happens next? When you get to 2025, they're now down to just 6. They've been evicted from all but 1 seat in Melbourne, all but 3 seats in Sydney, all seats in Adelaide, all but 1 seat in Perth, and they're not represented in either Darwin, Canberra or Hobart. Now, this is extraordinary for a party that seeks through its urban, liberal and national base, regional base, to build a bridge between city and country. So Parliament at the moment does not have a viable city-country party, which is, the bedrock of the old Menzies moral middle mandates. Now, remember, those mandates, when they were first sought in 49, achieved in 49, all the way through to the end of the 60s, had a good proportion of regional seats, but a decent base in the city. Now, we remember from 2022, a lot of what happened in 2022 was a few seats moved to the Labor side, a few seats moved from the Labor side to the Greens, and there's a Teal-type independent in Fowler. But most of the action's on the coalition side. So they've lost seats to Labor, they've lost seats to Greens, and they've also lost seats to the Teal independents. And we looked at the Teal independents in 2022 and we thought that this was the big structural story. I think the deeper story is not the third party representation on the crossbench. It is the collapse of the Liberal Party, and we're talking about the Liberal Party here, in the capital cities. Now, when an electorate goes back and does it again the second time, evicts a major party from the capitals and completes the job the second time, I think you're looking at a realignment. Now, last federal election, again, bearing in mind the Labor Party did not aim for 94. It would have struggled to got to about 80, 81, 82 on its best case scenario about 2 or 3 weeks out from the campaign. I've got about 2 or 3 headline ideas of what might have changed things. I think at the end of last year, it was certainly true, based on the published polling and also based on the private research that the parties were conducting, that Labor would have been lucky to finish ahead of the coalition in minority government. They may have got minority government, but they may have had fewer seats than the coalition. And this is about December, January. And that's sort of at the depths of Albanese's problem coming out of The Voice, the Beach House, really scratchiness about Labor's agenda, Labor's second-term agenda. A number of things change. I think the first thing that changes, which is really, really interesting, is Labor decided to make its forward offer for the next term on Medicare at the beginning of the year. It didn't wait for the campaign. It makes its forward offer on Medicare. Coalition then Me Too's them, backs the thing, and pretty much wedges itself without realising. It was a very, very strategically inept response to this thing. They just said, right, we'll take their spending and we'll top it up a little bit. Second thing that happens is the President of the United States assumes the job and starts governing in a way that he wasn't governing in the first term, governs in a way which is going to impact a swinging voter, a low information voter, an older voter, somebody sweating their superannuation balance. I think even before that sort of Freedom Day tariff announcement, I think you had a couple of examples of Trump's style for Trump 2.0 was going to rattle the cages of both the major parties in Australia. My observation on the single best moment that the Prime Minister had leading into the campaign was the day that he responded to the announcement on the tariffs. I think for most people in Australia, that's the first they would have heard the information. They would have heard the information from their Prime Minister saying that this is not an act of a friend. And I thought for whatever reason, they must have anticipated well, and he was on song by then. Coalition, we could talk a bit later about the coalition campaign. So you have Labor making a positive offer. Coalition struggled to respond, which is why they ended up with higher taxes and a bigger deficit. Don't ask me how they get to that conclusion, but that's how they ended up getting that conclusion. But the thing that started the ball rolling was the positive offer on Medicare. Then comes the ex-cyclone, which changes the timing of the election. I think Albanese was pretty clear he wanted to go in March, ended up going in May. And the difference between March and May probably is those extra 8 to 10 seats, because the thing that sits in the middle is the tariff shock from Trump. When you think about positive and negative shocks in an election and electoral cycle, 2022, even through to 2023 and into 2024, all the bad news ran against Labor. So you get jacking up of interest rates, you've got an inflation shock, you've got a supply crisis, and you've also got the misfire of The Voice. And you've got the Gaza conflict. None of those issues are breaking for the government, and a government can't really rise above any of those issues. Come 2025, interest rates are starting to come down. Inflation is almost back in the bottle. The genie's almost back in the bottle. And then Trump is what I would term a positive incumbent shock. It's a rally around the flag moment in the same way Tampa might have been in 2001 or September 11 might have been in 2001. Or if you remember some micro details of the 2004 campaign, there was a bombing attempt at the Indonesian embassy in the middle of that campaign. So there are occasions where international events can conspire to make a Prime Minister look like a leader, almost rising above the fray. The final thing that happens that breaks this thing open for Labor is, and this is the one bit I'll observe about the coalition strategy, they thought that there were seats to gain in the outer suburbs that would compensate for the loss of the inner city. They pretty much wrote the inner city off, and they thought that the outer suburbs offered them a path to power. I never thought that there were enough seats that they could turn, certainly in a single election cycle, seats that had never voted coalition before, especially given the diversity of those electorates. Let me give you another way to view the parliament now and view what the electorate has done, what the electorate has projected back on the parliament. And this is where I think the dysfunction is. So I mentioned earlier about the capital city versus rest of state. So that you've essentially got a metropolitan-sourced supermajority for Labor with a crossbench. The crossbench has now more crossbench members from serving urban seats than the coalition has in the lower house, and the Liberal Party has in the lower house. That is a problem. So you've got essentially a supermajority in the capitals, which is a much bigger gap than the urban base plus supermajority in the regions that previous coalition governments had. And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult parliament to manage, because a lot of the issues cut across city regional boundaries. When you think about something like climate change, you think about the immigration question, and it's a question. It's a question not so much about the numbers, it's about the distribution of those numbers, whether you concentrate them in the cities or you've figured out a way to decentralise some of that flow. And that parliament is not going to be any more functional than the previous parliament, because the coalition go to work every day still thinking that the parts of Australia they still represent, which are wider than older than the nation at large, are somehow real Australia. And they've also got an echo chamber at Sky After Dark, my former employers at News, for those of you who remember my backstory. Now, I'm going to give you one more bit of data, and this begins with a joke. It's a joke based around a fact. Labor people now tell this story to one another that if they heard the division bells and all the blokes in the lower house decided not to turn up to the division, only the women went into the chamber and there was a division. Now, would you lose the vote? This is the question they've all asked themselves, and they know what the answer is. There are 50 out of the 94 MPs in the lower house are women on the Labor side. The entire coalition, men and women, is 43. So the women would win that vote, which I think probably tells you more about where the two parties have ended up, even than the city versus country divide. It's the gender question. As I said, Labor on 50 is a representation for women in the parliament. They've almost doubled that number since 2019. They had 28 in the lower house. Now they've got 50. The coalition have gone from 15 down to 9. The crossbench has gone from 3 up to 10. There's two misalignments here. Well, they're realignments, but there's a misalignment when you think about how the coalition is representing itself back to the Australian people. It's more male, it's more regionally focused, it's whiter, and it's older than the country at large. This is quite a difficult time for them because the path back to majority government is not by picking up an extra couple of seats in the regions. The path back to majority government is to figure out where most people live and to come at them with something other than what in a sense they've grown up with. There's almost a generational issue here for that side of politics. For the Labor side, there's terrible, terrible, terrible downside if they become a complacent government. So they don't use their mandate. What happens to them? Well, they've already had a couple of warnings in terms of what happened to them in Brisbane at the previous election with the Greens and with Daly in Fowler. You can see that supermajority in the capitals whittle away. You could still see Labor forming a majority or a minority government, but with a much enlarged crossbench. And most of the enlargement in the crossbench at the moment, notwithstanding the lower primary votes in the regions, has already happened in the urban electorates. So I just sort of leave that as there's probably a bit more in there than we can take in, but that's my sort of view of the electorate and view of the last two elections especially. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Lots to think about. Maybe I'll hand over straight away to you, Frank.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, George. And I'm actually going to take up that last bit about what you do with 94 seats, actually. For me, a critical moment, actually, on the way to that disaster that the Liberals had at the last election, or the Coalition had at the last election, was the Dunkley by-election, which was in early 2024. And critically, it's after The Voice. And it basically, to me, suggested that the kind of broad coalition of voters that had put Labor in office in 2022 was still intact. And the coalition seems not to have read it. Basically, what I'm going to say here actually goes back more or less to that moment in a different sense. And I'd like to nominate one moment that I think tells us that if there is a new Australian politics, it might not really be all that new at all. And it is that time in early 2024 when the government announced that it would be altering the shape of those third stage tax cuts that had been legislated, of course, by the Morrison government in 2019 after that election. Now, here's Anthony Albanese at the National Press Club announcing them. This is what he had to say. I've just extracted a bit of the speech, of course. So today I announce that from the 1st of July this year, our government will deliver a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer. All 13.6 million taxpayers, not just some. Everyone who works and pays tax will benefit. This is a plan for middle Australia that delivers for every Australian taxpayer right up and down the income ladder, helping with the cost of living, nourishing aspiration and boosting participation, strengthening the connection between hard work and fair reward. Now, that backflip, as some called it, would be defended by reference to the cost of living especially, I think. It was seen as a response to an immediate and specific set of circumstances that the government faced. So here's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. This is about one thing and one thing only, help with the cost of living for more Australians. That was a strong theme, I think, in the defence of those changes. Now, one thing and one thing only. There are other ways in which the Prime Minister and Treasurer could have defended their tax cuts in the public square if they'd wanted to. Albanese could have said something like this at the National Press Club. I can't do an Anthony Albanese voice. You'll just have to bear with me. Must be from the wrong part of Italy myself, I guess. The last government, in the flush of its unexpected victory, legislated stage 3 tax cuts that would have made our tax system less progressive, a boon to the well-off and a burden to the rest. We use taxation for many things, to manage the economy, to fund services, and to influence who gets what, when and how, in a society where unfettered markets so often produce injustice and insecurity. The Coalition's tax cuts would have made Australia a more unequal place. Australians on $200,000 a year would have gained more than $9,000 a year extra in their income. Now, nobody begrudges people's success, least of all me with my nice new house on the Central Coast. I wouldn't really put that in the speech. But that's $9,000 that cannot be used to fund education or health or the 1,001 other things that we all need to live our best lives. That is not the Labor way. That is not the Australian way. We believe the best societies, the most democratic societies, the most cohesive societies are egalitarian places where opportunity and wealth are spread as widely as possible. Opportunity and wealth can be built by a fair wage and a fair tax system. They also come from access to the public goods that we create as a community, the many things we share, such as our great public schools and universities, our state-of-the-art pharmaceutical benefit scheme, and the little green and gold card that you all carry around in your pockets. My government is committed to ensuring that every policy we deliver on wages, tax and welfare, in health and education is an effort towards building a society that shuns great inequalities of wealth and opportunity. Our goal is a society that embraces community and reciprocity. Our vision is what Ben Chifley meant when he referred to a light on the hill. That light will burn brightly so long as I lead an Australian government. Now, you'll see why I'm an academic and not a speechwriter, but it's worth pausing, I think, why those income tax cuts could not be defended in those terms. Is it because social democrats here and elsewhere are wedded to arguing their corner in the neoliberal language, their opponents? Does it matter? Well, defenders of the Albanese government might simply say, I have a speech for you, that's all very interested, but pretty impractical. Just what I would expect from an academic with his head in the clouds or somewhere further south. We won 94 seats in the House of Representatives at the last election. Our opponents lie in ruins. We will probably govern for another 2 terms at least. It is what we do that matters, not windy talk about equality and inequality, justice and injustice. But then I might respond, the stories we tell about policy do matter. If elites won't talk about creating a more equal society, the ability to carry on meaningful debate about equality and inequality across a whole range of policy domains is accordingly reduced. So you have 94 seats, but your primary vote sits in the mid-30s. You were big on the spending commitments during the election campaign, but you had little to offer on the issues that everyone can see need to be tackled. Stagnant productivity, global warming, environmental destruction, an unsatisfactory tax system and revenue base, intergenerational inequity, a starvation-level unemployment benefit, falling educational standards, underinvestment in research and development, the parlous state of the universities. You did offer some housing policies, but the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So what are you going to do with all those seats and a Senate where with the Greens you can pass any bill you like without the support of the coalition? Would they have an answer, I wonder? Perhaps they might read me a favourite passage from Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance, apparently a great favourite in those circles at present. But there's no avoiding, I think, Paul Keating's idea of burning political capital. You have a certain amount of it in government and you either use it well or you waste it.
Thanks very much, Frank. We enjoy that. Ben, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks, George and Frank. They were wonderful interventions. So I wanted to do a bit of a reflection on, I suppose, the demographic shifts that have been going on underneath these transformations in the Parliament, and talk about one of the words I don't think anyone has mentioned yet, which we maybe if we went back 40 or 50 years, we would think is at the centre of almost all debates we talk about in politics, and that's class. And talk about what my colleagues Mark Riboldi and Phoebe Heyman are starting to think about around 3 Gs of generation, gender and geography that seem to be reshaping the contours of the politics that we're seeing. And I think George has already talked a bit about geography. I'll come back to that briefly at the end. But if we look at the vote on a whole range of different polls over quite a long time now, over both these terms, and we organise them by age or we organise them by gender, we would see a stark line that saw the 2PP vote of Labor much higher amongst young people and much higher amongst women, and the coalition relatively, and in fact amongst older people, still a majority party and doing not badly amongst men. One of the interesting things about those shifts is that if you went inside them and you saw, so amongst young people is the Labor Party, which is polling well into the 60s, in some polls even close to 70 amongst young people in two-party preferred terms, is the Labor Party smashing it out of the park? No, it's not. And if you look at the vote by gender and you look at how Labor is travelling amongst women or how the coalition's travelling amongst men, you go, they're also not really smashing it out of the park. Those transformations are concentrated amongst the other players. Because the Greens vote, Labor's vote actually by age looks relatively flat. It does go down a bit at the end, but it's relatively flat. But the Greens vote goes off a cliff. It is steeply defined now by age and by generation. So much so, I think also that it's transformed who the Greens are, partly, and is one of the factors behind why they potentially lost some lower house seats while maintaining their overall vote. If we went back 10 years ago, we would probably say that the Greens is a very white party. Well, you can't poll over 30% amongst people in their early 20s and be a white party. So something is changing and transforming there that is adding to these enormous Labor majorities. Now, are those things independent of class? Have we left class and we've entered an era of post-materialism? I'd suggest it's actually a bit the opposite of that. What we've seen is a transformation in what are very economic relationships. So when we unpack what's going on with young people and with older people, we find that what is even better at explaining those vote patterns than people's age is their ownership of assets, which are strongly correlated with age. And if you look inside occupations and you find surprisingly that the equal lowest occupations, one of them is unsurprising for the ALP and 2PP terms, is managers. The other is tradies. And you look at what the highest vote is, it's amongst personal and care workers. But again, Labor's vote amongst those two groups is actually pretty even between tradies and personal and care workers. The vote for the micro-right amongst tradies is well over 20%. And the vote for the Greens amongst personal care workers is also well over 20%. And then you think about, well, how would we think about those two occupations if we weren't thinking about them as being gendered labour? So at the heart of these two apparent shifts away from class, generation and gender, we seem to actually see a story that returns us to the two oldest bits of class, owning assets and what kind of work you do. But that looks very different to the world we had before. And most of the action that's going on there is not in either major party. Now, the final one, geography. So George has already talked about the devastation that's already happened, but I was looking through the new pendulum that's been organised, and I thought, well, imagine if there was another swing to the progressive side of politics. Imagine there was a uniform 5% swing to the Labor Party at the next election. What would that do? It would mean there are more National Party MPs than Liberal Party MPs. The safest 5 seats for the coalition are all held by the National Party, and the National Party doesn't hold a single seat under 5%. All of the marginals are held by the Liberal Party. And when we think about it in 2PP terms, and this is where I'll finish, I think there is something actually much, much more stable about the way this is shifting than in many other countries. It is surprising how flat Labor's vote is amongst these different categories. It's doing something that I think is really interesting, where they seem to be able to not annoy any group that much and maintain a reasonable level support amongst most core bits of the population, and then position themselves to be able to benefit in 2PP terms. That's a conversation you can't have almost anywhere else in the world. So if we were in the UK, obviously, you need to actually get people to vote for you in a first-past-the-post system. But even if you're in the proportional systems in Europe, then as your primary vote falls, you have to form coalition governments with other players, and that completely transforms the picture. But more than that, in these non-compulsory systems, where the composition of who's voting changes quite a bit between elections, it is entirely realistic to appeal to some new constituency who weren't voting, or to fail to turn out the people who usually vote for you. And that can make those primary votes quite unstable, and combined with the electoral systems can make the parliaments very unstable. But we actually know that almost everyone did turn up at the last election, and they were forced to choose between Labor and the coalition, and they overwhelmingly chose the Labor Party in numbers that Labor's rarely ever seen. That is a really big shift that is necessary to be able to shift that 2PP pendulum back. That is, I think, quite different to what's being experienced by many other countries. And one of the reasons why I think both the shift in general to Labor, but also that fragmentation, that both those things, I think we're going to get used to how they play out a lot more in these new categories in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Been perfectly to time as well.
Is that working?
Yeah. Go for it, Elizabeth.
So I'm not going to talk about data from the Albanese election, and I'm feeling a bit out of place now on this panel. I want to kind of take us a little bit back in time to think about, well, why do we, despite landslide elections and unprecedented majorities and no seats for Liberals in various geographies, you'd have to say the Labor Party's in a mess, right? Nobody thinks that this is a stable, organised government with a vision for the future. And so I want to ask, how did we get here? The growth of mass participation in democratic politics from the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century really was based in a widespread acceptance of the importance of representative politics, premised on really a structure that was mass membership in political parties and in countries like Australia, trade unions. This was what I would call the social base that gave legitimacy to a two-party system in this country, and the Liberals have their own political bases as well. However, over certainly the last part of last century and into this century, there's been internationally a growing mood of public disaffection towards politicians and the political system itself. And they're two different things. Like the best evidence for this comes out of the United Kingdom, where they can compare interviews with ordinary people back many, many decades into the early part of last century with what people say today. The conclusions are, nobody's ever loved politicians. That won't surprise anybody in the room. But people didn't actually feel completely disconnected and hate the political system itself. And this is a new development in the latter part of last century and in the recent decades. And so one of the questions has been, how did this happen? There's lots of competing explanations, some arguing it's based in kind of the relinquishment of economic policy making in the neoliberal era. Others suggest there's a longer-term rupture taking place that predates the kind of neoliberalism that took off in the late 70s and 80s, even if it sped up this kind of disaffection with politics in that era. And why wouldn't people be frustrated when politicians respond to cost of living crises, climate change, housing problems, starvation level unemployment benefits with, well, the market will sort it out? Of course, it hasn't been all this way, and Frank for PM, based on your speech, but Frank pointed to a range of the alternative ways in which politicians have responded in the past, particularly in the Labor Party. Voters want the political class to solve issues. They don't want a market to do that. And so we can't be surprised with even people who are still voting for the Labor Party being extremely frustrated with that vision. And neoliberalism is, of course, largely on the nose in the electorate and has really been since I guess, like the early to mid-90s. And there's widespread support for expanding direct funding into improving education, health, and building public and social housing directly. So why is it the way it is? And with this kind of lack of vision, I think it is worth thinking about. Peter Mayer wrote a great book called Ruling the Void, which was really about Europe, but some of his arguments about anti-politics and this kind of disaffection, he argues, more widely applicable. And it's something I've sort of turned to think about how do we know people are disaffected? In Europe, it's really quite clear there's not compulsory voting, and so turnout has been heading down over time. But one of the most clever ways he explains it is, he says, when scientists are looking at climate change, the measures don't have to always go down. Sometimes they jump back up. It's about all the measures over time trending in the same direction. And he then looks at turnout, a whole range of different things. Luke Mancello, myself, and Simon Copland tried to do a similar thing in Australia, understanding that some of perhaps the hatred of politicians, the disaffection, and the chaos would be papered over a bit by our system of compulsory voting. But on all the measures of informal votes, donkey votes, membership of political parties, membership of trade unions, membership of civil society organisations, all the measures that we can look at in terms from electoral data, all the social attitudes we can look at from those sorts of surveys, plus what we know about who is the member of these institutions that held up social democracy in the 20th century in Australia, are trending in the same direction. So for me, when I hear Labor, massive Labor majority, and I guess a landslide election, we have to put that in context that things can bounce around in one election or even two. We don't yet know whether this is actually some kind of sea change in that sort of wider problem of what I would term anti-politics. I think the other thing I want to end on is that for me, if we go back to the 1970s and the election of Whitlam, the hopes out of the social movements, the large-scale industrial struggle that claimed more of profit in Australia for ordinary working people, and the civil rights, feminist, and then later movements around sexuality and others, this was a time of enormous hope. It was also a time of a lot of kind of a fractious society as well, right? Real disputes by organised labour, particularly after the dismissal, and the unions are, absolutely outside the state, right? They have no role in creating policy. When Bob Hawke and the Labor Party are building for the 1983 election, they are constructing a national project which they are projecting as being in everyone's interest. What I would call a hegemonic project, where there is a vision about the future, but that vision is not just based on words, it's based on bringing those mass trade unions, those enormous memberships of political parties and businesses into a process of designing this new future for us. But as we know, that new future has delivered what we have today. It delivered neoliberalism, but you don't have to have lived through that period to understand that the market is not solving your problem in terms of affordable and high quality housing, or that you can't or your relative can't get on the marketized NDIS because they keep changing the rules to keep people out of it. So I think young people, as much as older people, understand, I think, the kind of the lack of vision, the lack of a ability to construct a new national project. Now, often those national projects, they're more than just the rhetoric. They have to actually bring together sections of society. And I think the problem for both parties is the institutions that allowed that to happen last century and under Hawke and Keating in the 80s no longer exist. And so they cannot bring those substantial sections of society together in that project. That means they're often, like, small target is one aspect in how politicians are working. But if we think about the most recent economic and productivity get-together that the federal government had, it's on the basis of, a small number of people unconnected from the ordinary voters that they need to appeal to, coming together to make policy that doesn't do anything, and nobody trusts the politicians that they'll actually deliver when they have a bit more vision. Even if we think about the voice, the one thing where the Labor Party said it was going to have a referendum on voice, it was limited, it was without truth, it was without processes around treaty, and they failed to, I think, deal with the really substantial issues that particularly young voters want to stare down. The history of racism in Australia. We had our acknowledgement of country about stolen land. These are questions that loom large for many voters, but also that we need to actually have that truth-telling process in order to deal with substantial issues like racism in society. They may be able to avoid these issues, patch together this government, but you can't defer these serious problems in society always, because, society sort of comes back on these issues, right? You can't remove class either, as Ben is sort of mentioning, like to just pretend there's not class in Australian society, which is, I think, sometimes the way Albanese talks, right? He talks about a middle class as being the sort of average, but actually, if we think about the needs of people who are in that biggest group in Australian society, in the end, they do make demands. And I think the Labor Party knows it might want to play small strategy, but it's got a problem in also, I think, keeping the voters it has, right? And those voters don't seem to actually believe that this party will deliver anything for them. And that is a massive problem for even the voters they've held on to. And that won't go away, in my view.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We've been seeing, or we've got a screen here, so we've been seeing all of the questions pop up and the comments. Luxury automated communism? Yep. Oh, there we go. That's voted up.
That's the one.
Amazing. So just very quickly, just to riff a little bit off what you were sort of finishing off with, Elizabeth, I was going to ask this anyway, and then you sort of started to talk about the current Albanese government. And George, you mentioned towards the beginning sort of a question about what happens to an opposition when they go to a landslide defeat. And I would like to maybe flip that question a little bit. And some of what you were talking about, Elizabeth, this sort of lack maybe of kind of national hegemonic project, but also there's this lack of unity within the unions at the moment as well. There's a fractured union movement. We've seen the WARFEs, the CFMEU, the ETU and other unions separate from the ACTU. So there's a fracturing within the union movement as well as the broader kind of labour drifting from the union movement. But I digress. What happens to an Albanese government with such a large majority?
The way the Labor Party see their 3 years, this year is consolidation, delivery of election promises. Next year is supposed to be the year where they take a few risks, but we don't know what those risks are. But I wouldn't underestimate how difficult the global operating environment is at the moment. You've noticed that the PM is darting all over the globe trying to get an hour of Donald Trump's time, which I'm not sure he needs necessarily, certainly not with the cameras rolling. You've just had an announcement, without getting too short-term about it, Vanuatu's just elevated its policing arrangement with the Chinese, so there's a competition in the Pacific. There's a sense that the global climate, the good faith as opposed to the bad faith actors in Europe are fracturing on climate. So there's a lot happening in and around the world that'll make it very, very difficult to govern, notwithstanding all the other things that have been gifted to Labor the last 6 months, including that majority. Policies, so they know housing 2 to 3 years from now is something that they have to show progress on. But they've also got a particular problem on housing, which is it sits between jurisdictions. And so a lot of the action is between a federal Labor government and a New South Wales Labor government. A bit less so with Victoria, because the Victorians are at the end of a long-term government cycle and their interests are not aligned with a recently elected and a recently re-endorsed Labor government. But housing is the thing that I would keep an eye on all the way through. They've got a minister who is probably one of the smartest of the young up-and-comers, also a bit polariser within the caucus, but is one of the smartest and will probably bring the best evidence to the table. But there are so many vested interests in housing and so many cross-jurisdictional questions that don't get answered very easily. I mean, I could talk to you about housing for an hour on just taxation and labour supply, but I don't want to do that here tonight. And they're thinking about next year being the year of bold thinking.
It's the year of bold thinking. Okay. What I will do is just actually quickly, could I maybe just see a show of hands who has sort of immediate questions, just so I can gauge time-wise? Let's maybe start. This has been bouncing around, so focus has been on the political parties' policies and positioning. What about other actors in the Australian political sphere, e.g. the media and Gina?
Well, I'll be happy to have a go at that. I mean, the fact that I think, who is it? The British political scientist talks about the Conservative Party in the media. Tim Bale, I think it is, isn't it? And of course there is a coalition in the media, which is Sky After Dark and elements of the Murdoch media and so on. And, I guess it first began to occur to me in a serious way back in 2007. You were still there, I think, George. The fact that Murdoch media had become a player within the a serious player within the internal politics of the coalition, and the issue then was particularly the leadership between Howard and Costello was becoming a problem for the coalition. It was a destabilising factor. And, whatever, 15, 18 years on or whatever it is, you could magnify that by about 10, I reckon. I mean, look at what happened to the coalition and to Peter Dutton at the last election. Increasingly, as the campaign wore on, he was drawn into this sort of culture wars thing, a kind of intense desire, it seemed, to talk to the converted, to preach to the converted in those places where there were no votes to be won at all, but there were more voters to be alienated every time he opened his mouth on whatever it happened to be, welcomes to country, or I think an earlier one in the campaign was indoctrination of students in schools, a whole range of sort of culture wars type issues. And I think this is about the relationship between that side of politics and this kind of media echo chamber that has now become, I think, incredibly damaging for them. And somehow or other, I mean, we can see it again, post-election with the problems that Susan Lee has. That is a serious problem. There is a reactionary populist movement which is very Americanised, that certainly, yes, Gina Reinhardt is a part of, and plenty of others too, that it is a real problem now, I think, for the coalition, and an enormous advantage electorally for Labor in the way that Ben explained, actually, allowing them to occupy something that you call the centre ground, because these people seem so far out there.
So I think that one of the real challenges for the coalition is exactly that there is global Anglophone strategy developed in the United States that doesn't in any way map on to the demography of Australia. And even just at a very broad level, like it's not just the big cities, like the mega cities, the cities over 2 million people, and there's 4 of them in Australia, that's more than half of the population. And that, like, the US looks nothing like that. So, in fact, the Australian electoral map is quite similar to the US electoral map. It just doesn't work here. So I think that is a really central problem for them. Can I quickly do the top one?
It's been sitting there for a while, so yes, please,
And
yeah.
Just note
So just
that 200 have just appointed Kate Hook as regional co-convener, and can they have success regionally as the Climate 200 brand? So we've been looking a little bit at independent minor parties winning, going back quite a way. First of all, a lot of the things we're seeing now are not that new. They, you think about what was happening with Clover Moore in the late 80s and early 90s with the John Hatton and so forth. We can see some echoes. But one of the really striking things that we looked at geographically is that the one place that independents and minor parties don't win seats is in the outer suburbs. That is the main electoral battleground between the major parties. They win in the bush and they win in the inner city, but they don't win in the outer suburbs. So, and I think that partly reflects the bases of the major parties rebelling against them in different directions and not feeling part of that. Whereas major parties for quite a while have been winning elections in the suburbs, and so have been quite attentive to the kinds of concerns that outer suburbs voters have. And potentially also that, new suburbs by definition tend to be less organised and maybe don't have the civil society muscles that are necessary to be able to do this. And regional voters certainly do. I think there's certainly potential for a regional insurgency. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I certainly think there's potential.
And then, George, do you have any final comments on any of the last two questions?
I probably should pass on immigration, but I will make two observations about the geography. My definition of migrant is born overseas or born locally with at least one migrant parent. It's the Bureau of Stats and I cooked up this thing for the 2021 census, which was obviously released in 2022. Now, Australia became majority migrant, a first and second generation migrant just before COVID, just before lockdown. Then we lost net about 500,000 people and house prices went up as a lot of people went home and went back to where they came from, as Scott Morrison told them to. And then when they reopened the borders, we were only just back on the trend line we were before COVID. Now, what does a majority migrant electorate mean for what we've just seen in 2022 and 2025, given we crossed the threshold before 2019? It means in Melbourne and Sydney, it's almost impossible to go into either of those capital cities where a good 40% of all the seats are, given that that's where the population is. 40% of the nation's population is in Melbourne and Sydney. It's very difficult, and the Liberal Party have now learnt this lesson twice. It's very difficult to go into those capitals with an anti-migrant message. And it's because it's not about housing or infrastructure. Migrants will take it personally. So Chinese communities, which were conservative through the previous decade, state government here, and with both Malcolm Turnbull and for one term Scott Morrison, all those seats went in 2022, and then the last two, which are in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, went at the last election. So the immigration issue is very, very complicated for a major party to run the anti-immigration. And also, it's just a bad look for a party seeking to be a governing party to go down that particular hole. It's okay for One Nation to brand on it, but there's a ceiling on their vote. And that ceiling is being lowered on them. The more migration is not just the majority of population growth, but in some places in Australia, it's the entirety of the growth over the last 10 or so years. So migrants and their kids. So that's one observation about migration. The other observation, just quickly, Ben, on the regions, it's interesting. Climate 200 did go hard at the last election in the regions and went backwards. Which was very interesting. And I was down there at Warrnambool earlier this year for a long weekend, and he had his orange buff. I can't remember his name now, the former Triple J. Yeah. He was everywhere and he had good ground game, a lot of volunteers, and that electorate just said, no, mate. And there's the other one, which is Cowper, hasn't swung. But, and this is the big but, the National Party MP who quit the party over the Voice.
Claire.
Yeah, Claire. Andrew G, got to hold his seat. A lot of the independent action is ex-nationals when you count them all up. So I think that I don't think Climate 200, Northern New South Wales, certainly Surf Coast of Victoria, you could see the spots where it might work, parts of outer Brisbane. in the absence of Green candidates. I'm just not sure it would break in quite the same way we had that perfect storm in 2022. Yeah.
And remember, I mean, one of the most interesting, if you're looking at Teals and Climate 200, one of the most interesting developments at the last election is they challenged very successfully, didn't quite get there, in Labor seats. In fact, traditionally pretty safe Labor seats. We're talking Fremantle and, of course, Bean in the ACT. So that suggests they're not a one-trick pony. It's not just about displacing Liberals in affluent metropolitan seats. The Labor Party needs to keep an eye on that. Yeah.
So
maybe we'll do quickly.
Yeah. So the arc I draw back, and this is the thing that hasn't eventuated yet, but may have started in Fowler, is when you look at those outer suburban seats and you look at the ethnic composition of those outer suburban seats now, because most of the population that's sort of moving to the outer suburbs now, it's kind of a reverse of the post-war sort of white flight from the inner city to the burbs. Most of the migrants tend to land either in the inner city as students or in the outer suburbs as young families. You saw a couple of candidates try to play the tribal card, the Muslim vote, or a couple of places in Victoria where Indian candidates were pre-selected. Now, because Daly was able to pull it off, and Daly had 20-year presence in that locality, that tends to be the identifier, doesn't it? Going all the way back to North Sydney in the federal with Ted Mack. So if there are grassroots, and there may be more previous migration wave rather than the current ones, rather than the skilled ones, if there are a number of grassroots migrant community, but new Australians, we're not talking about an ethnic politician, we're talking about an Australian politician with a migrant background, it's possible that the dam wall might be breached there. But that's if Labor's there for 2 or 3 terms.
I was just going to say, with anti-politics, it's not just that there is this disaffection and there is this evidence for this sort of hatred, withdrawal from politics. There's a sort of second component, which is the desire of politicians and political parties to trade on that phenomenon, right? And so I do see One Nation, Trumpet of Patriots and previous iterations of that particular person. But the Teals, some of this is about capitalising on a real disaffection that they see in society. In the end, though, it is by its nature pretty precarious, because if those politicians can't actually deliver changes, then that little, upsurge of vote can disappear pretty quickly. And I think this is the history of One Nation. Now, another component of that is there is deep-seated racism in this country, right? And they're tapping into that. But when we look at other examples, and anti-politics is not left or right, it's a phenomenon that sort of happens in both ways. But if we look at Beppe Grillo's 5-Star movement in Italy, if we look at the Indignados movement in Spain, we look at other kind of more left-wing or centrist examples of this kind of political parties building or trading on that, actually they've been pretty unstable. And so I think what will be interesting now is what does happen with One Nation, the Teals, and these ruckuses that lead to politicians or independents getting elected, but can actually they sustain it? And I think in some ways the election of the Greens in Brisbane is one example of that, how sort of tenuous that can be. And so for me, these things have to be longitudinal, and we can't always just conclude what is happening in politics from this particular election only. And that gives us some hope, because presumably everyone in this room does not want to see the One Nation vote rise.
Hi there. So I'm just wondering, at the end of the last election, both the Greens and the Liberals said that it was political immaturity or not knowing how to vote. Is that evidence of a political horseshoe? And if so, does that mean that we have a political horseshoe?
Maybe we'll take the two questions just in the interest of time, and then you could maybe choose which one you'd like to answer. We can go in a line.
My question was about tax reform and the likelihood of it actually, of us having a serious discussion about it. It seems Chalmers was sort of flagging it not long ago. It seems Albanese's not too keen to have the discussion. But I think in any discussion about, how we approach climate, housing, all those sorts of big issues. A lot of the things that Ken Henry was flagging years ago in his review, which, I think only 3 of them were implemented out of the 18 recommendations. None of them have been implemented, and we don't really seem to have serious discussions when it comes to this issue.
Maybe George, would you like to pick a question to answer?
I think I can give you a sort of inside the tent answer on tax reform. At the next election, they probably will have some form of tax reform package to take to the people. And one of the reasons they need to do it is bracket creep, squeezing their base, lower and middle income earners, into higher tax brackets. And they're going to have to redistribute some of those windfalls in the budget. I don't think they'll go housing. I don't think housing becomes a tax reform conversation. Housing is a just try to get the states working, and planning codes and all the other stuff. And it may also be labour supply. But the budget itself is, depending on what happens in the world in the next couple of years, may be swimming back to surplus, or it may crater. And if it's the second case scenario, if it does crater because of global events, then you've probably got impetus to do more than I think Anthony Albanese is prepared to think about now. I think one thing I've observed the last 4 years is when the deadline actually comes, probably like some of you as you're preparing some of your work. I know myself as a daily journalist, the deadline tended to focus my mind a lot better than the conception of the story at the beginning of the day when it went on the news list. Remember what Stage 3 was about. Stage 3 was an idea that Labor would look at its inheritance, which it's not an inheritance it wanted. It wanted to look at it in the context of the 2022 budget, and then Albanese said, no, I'm not going to break a promise. As you got closer to the cuts were legislated, the delivery of tax cuts to coalition voters by a Labor government, that focused his mind. And that's when they had a proper look at it. He had a second go at it. And Chalmers developed, it's not a bad relationship the two of them had. It wasn't very trusting beforehand, but it became a little more trusting during the Stage 3 debate, because the Treasurer sent the Prime Minister out on a mission to break a promise, and he got away with it. And I think there's a bit more trust in the Treasury now than there might have been 2 years ago. So in a sense, watch this space on events forcing the PM to take a stand.
Would anyone like to answer the first question?
So I think, riffing off Elizabeth, that there is a strong sentiment of being disillusioned with politics in general, which isn't particularly left or right. And a lot of that anti-politics vote, which might go to the Trumpet of Patriots, might sometimes go to the Greens and others, is people who are just genuinely disillusioned with politics. And the one thing I'll say that I think Australia has been somewhat lucky was that housing debate before in the last term was completely dominated by the Greens. And if it hadn't been, I think there would have been a lot more voting on migration as a housing issue. I think that, in fact, the framing of that issue as by the Greens shifted a lot of those voters to the left in a way that they, in the absence of that kind of argument being made, probably wouldn't have happened.
I don't have much hope on the question of taxation, to be honest. Like, if we look back to Hawke and Keating, decreasing business tax, the GST, bracket creep was a big problem as well in the Hawke-Keating era because they wanted more money to do things with. I think when, yes, Chalmers is making some noises, I'm much more worried about his ongoing talk of productivity, which we all know means either working harder or longer. I don't know about you, but do you know anybody who's not working hard or long hours? And yet that's where I see Chalmers' main emphasis is about productivity. And that's a message from business and the top end of town. The more we talk about the realities of the average workday for all of us and all the people we know, I think that's the way to force the debate in a direction which then becomes, okay, well, if we're actually going to relieve some of these pressures, we need more. We need more tax revenue in order to do that. The lucky thing is, people say they would pay more tax to fund education and health and housing. And so we do have something to work with. There is a sentiment the state should do things in this country, and we have that to work with.